Just before we dive back into the episode, I wanted to quickly share something that might interest you, especially if today's conversation has got you thinking about your own sustainability work. Some of the things we hear most in this industry are, I wish I could connect with other people doing this work, or I'd love to turn my sustainability expertise into something more. Well, 51 to Carbon Zero, the sponsor of this podcast, have created their own referral network. And it does exactly that. This isn't about selling you something, it's actually about helping you make money while building the sustainability community we all need. So here's what's in it for you. First, you get to join a genuine community of sustainability experts who share knowledge, refer work to each other, and solve problems together. So, no more working in isolation. Secondly, there's real money involved. There's 10% plus commission on software referrals. We're talking about projects that go from 30 grand up to 100 grand. Plus, you'll be able to boost your presence by taking part in our fireside chats. I've actually got an email in front of me from Louise Stevens, one of the ambassadors, and it says that all her clients are genuinely happy because she's got a great partner and her clients love them. But here's the bigger picture. You'll be helping accelerate the sustainability transition that we all desperately need. Every referral, every connection, every collaboration moves us closer to the world we're all working towards. If this resonates with you and you want to earn some extra income, click the link in our show notes to become a 51 to Carbon Zero ambassador. Okay, back to the show. Hi, welcome to the Sustainable Business Podcast with me, Will Richardson. This week we're looking at the world of fashion. With London Fashion Week coming to an end at the weekend, we thought it would be right to look at an industry that has a particularly poor reputation when it comes to its carbon impact. When combining all parts of the product cycle, the UN estimates that the global fashion industry contributes between 8 and 10% of all carbon emissions, and so-called fast fashion continues to be greatly scrutinised by campaign groups for its impact on the environment. Joining me today is a prominent voice in the world of sustainable fashion. It's Alicia Thew from Green Element, who's done work with the industry group Fashion Declares, as well as working with a number of businesses in the fashion industry to help them decarbonise their supply chains and production practices. Welcome, Alicia.
Hi, Will. Thanks so much for having me. Really excited to be chatting on the podcast today.
Yeah, no, so am I, considering we work so much together. And you definitely know your stuff on this subject. So I'm looking at trying to pull that out so that people can understand what it is to do and, learn more about such a complicated industry as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think sort of fashion is something that's quite close to my heart anyway, sort of obviously aside from my environmental career. So sort of marrying the two together is a really exciting area for me.
Brilliant. So first and foremost, how big an issue are the carbon emissions caused by the fashion industry?
Yeah, so as you mentioned in the introduction there, the fashion industry is responsible for about 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions, which is quite a big proportion. And those greenhouse gas emissions are mainly associated with the fossil fuels, which is used to generate the energy which goes into sort of all the different life stages of producing clothing or footwear or accessories. So everything from extracting the raw materials, whether that sort of be growing cotton, through to the raw materials processing, things like dyeing, manufacturing, so actually making the fabric itself and then making the garments, and then obviously all of the distribution as well, which goes alongside that. And according to the United Nations, the apparel industry as a whole actually uses more energy than both the aviation and shipping industries combined, which is quite staggering, really, given how carbon intense both of those industries are. I suppose also it's also worth mentioning that greenhouse gas emissions, global warming, isn't the only environmental impact caused by the fashion industry. The industry actually uses huge volumes of water. input into sort of growing the raw materials as well as the materials processing, as well as sort of harmful chemicals involved, particularly in textiles dyeing, and all that sort of water use, energy use, and then the waste as well that comes out the other side, which both the production is responsible for, but also as consumers, we are also responsible for that wastage. So yeah, it's obviously greenhouse gases major issue, but there are lots of other things going on as well.
And I think you kind of answered my question inadvertently. The next question I had was, well, because what I was going to ask you was, if we just switch to renewables, then that whole, emissions would reduce. But actually, what you're saying is it's not just about the emissions. There's so much more to it. It's so multifaceted.
Yeah, absolutely. And sort of one of the main sort of recommendations, for the production process as a whole would be switching over to 100% renewable energy, and that would have a massive impact. But it's not the only impact, as you say. We've got to sort of account for these other sort of sustainability issues of the industry as a whole.
And how much is it down to production methods, or is it all because of the demand?
It's a really good question, and it's kind of both. So basically, all the different stages, as I sort of went through, the raw materials production, the preparation, the processing of the materials, and then the garments, are all really energy intensive processes. And a report actually by McKinsey estimated that was accounted for about 70% of the total greenhouse gas emissions generated from the apparel industry. So all those sort of production methods and processes that are going on. And when we look at the sort of whole life cycle of clothing, including the consumer use and disposal, which also, we also need to account for and think about, companies that have already been through this carbon footprinting process, fashion brands such as Levi, Strauss and H&M as well, have estimated that around 20% of their total carbon footprints are actually down to the consumer use and the disposal of clothing. So that's actually that post-production part of it, which is quite a big chunk. And overproduction, obviously, is a really big part of the problem, because if we made less, then global emissions from all stages of the production, including that use and end of life, would be reduced, because there would be fewer clothes in circulation in general, which is a really sort of strong reason why we can't ignore the consumer aspect of the industry's impact as well. The industry needs to make much more effort to promote repairing, refurbishing, second-hand clothing, and sort of making long-lasting, good quality clothing in the first place, which doesn't need to be replaced all the time. Sort of bringing down the pure number of garments in circulation, as well as decarbonising the processes.
I was listening to a programme that had Primark's head of sustainability on the other day. It was Deborah Meaden's podcast, and she was talking about how environmental they are becoming. But I think you've just hit the nail on the head. It doesn't matter about the practices, it's about how much you're making. If the most of the emissions come from actually fast fashion, then fast fashion shouldn't exist.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a whole sort of societal change as well, as a sort of a way of thinking. And that sort of needs to come from the top down, in terms of how do we sort of normalize, clothing, buying secondhand clothes and repairing our own clothes or sending it to be refurbished. So I think once we tackle that sort of mindset in just reducing consumption, will be a long way towards reducing sort of global emissions from the industry.
Yeah, I guess you can make the most quality clothes, and if you're making too much of it, that's the crux of it. So what are some of the steps fashion businesses can take when it comes to their own operations?
So within a company's own operations is usually where they have the most autonomy and control over what can actually be measured and changed. And I suppose sort of a starting point which feeds actually into the production process will be the design of clothing and shoes and accessories and sort of, all of those sorts of things. Making sure that the fabrics that are chosen have longevity, are sustainably produced, and that the clothing is made with a mind that it could be repaired one day and then be reused after that. So I think design is really important aside from that, in terms of a company's own sites and own sort of operational sites, whether that be retail outlets, shops, offices, warehouses, attention can obviously be paid to the energy efficiency of those buildings, as well as ensuring that 100% renewable is used, cutting out the use of fossil fuels, those sorts of things. And also, as well, sort of a nod again to the water use efficiency and ensuring that waste is disposed of appropriately as well is really important. I'd say aside from buildings, if a company has its own fleet of vehicles, they can consider whether they could switch to electric vehicles instead, which could be charged then with their 100% renewable electricity tariffs. And sort of, in addition to that, there are some really great courses by the Smart Freight Centre and Energy Savings Trust as well on sort of fleet efficiency. So, anything to do with sort of logistics and operations, which are within a company's own control. And there are lots of improvements that can be made there. And I suppose finally as well, just to mention sort of the decisions made with regards to the material and packaging choices that are actually used, sort of, can we use less, considering all the materials that are being used, considering whether they can be reused, is really important and something that brands do actually have influence over.
It's really interesting to hear about the operational side, but should companies focus solely on their own practices, or is it also important, to look at the suppliers and distributors within their ecosystem?
Yeah, so I think it's absolutely essential that companies also look at their suppliers and distributors, because that forms a huge part of their Scope 3 emissions. So we mentioned at the start that around 70% of the greenhouse gas emissions from the industry as a whole are actually related to the first stages of production, which are often performed by third-party suppliers, distributors, etc. So just to remind ourselves, that's producing the raw materials, processing the raw materials and making the garments. And that means essentially that focusing efforts there can have the greatest collective impact. Having said that, that's also an area of the supply chain that companies tend to really struggle with, because they have the least influence over their suppliers, and so it can prove a bit tricky. And that's why, in general, sort of we suggest a really collaborative approach to tackling Scope 3 supply chain emissions, sort of opening the conversation with suppliers and seeing how they respond to sort of implementing electric vehicles into their fleets, or changing the materials they use, or switching to renewable energy. Are there sort of any incentives that you can provide? Can you invest money in new technologies which will work with suppliers to sort of make their processes more efficient? And I think it's actually really interesting that the Science Based Targets Initiative, actually for their Scope 3 targets, one of the sort of optional pathways is sort of a collaborative approach of bringing your suppliers along with you. So we'll a target to get them to sign up to science-based targets. And I think that's really interesting, and just sort of highlights the collaboration that's needed sort of within the industry as a whole.
It's such an important part of the reduction strategy, isn't it, for that collaboration, for the suppliers to all work together and have that lead. We hear a lot about offsetting within the supply chain, and what are your thoughts on that?
Decarbonisation of the supply chain is the only real way to tackle the carbon footprint of the industry. And so that's sort of the path that we take all of our clients down. I mentioned the Science Based Targets Initiative. And so just to sort of talk a little bit about that, sort of to set the scene. The Science Based Targets Initiative is sort of a collaboration with some of the really big hitters, so the UN Global Compact, the World Resources Institute, WWF, who have sort of designed this framework for companies to set targets which put you on track, your carbon emissions reductions on track, to meet and align with 1.5 degrees cap on global warming. And eventually to meet what we sort of call science-based net zero by 2050 at the latest. So science-based targets are really robust, they're very meaningful, and as I sort of mentioned, in line with the climate science. And there are lots of benefits to setting them as well, including sort of improved resilience, sort of preparation for regulations that might come into place, improved credibility, really positive for company reputation, and can be quite cost effective as well, depending on sort of the strategies and efficiencies that are put in place as part of your carbon reduction strategy, and a real way to sort of future-proofing your business. So setting science-based targets basically involves setting a short-term target over 5 to 10 years, and then a long-term net zero target, which must, your net zero target date must be 2050 by the latest. And basically what that means for your net zero target is that companies need to reduce their emissions by at least 90% by their net zero target date. And then only those residual emissions, which is around 10% at the end, can then be removed via permanent carbon removals. And they can be nature-based or technology-based, such as direct air capture and storage.
So in a nutshell, you wouldn't offset because it's not scientifically proven.
Yeah, exactly. So carbon offsetting is used by some companies sort of as, as an alternative, a quicker fix than this. And I suppose, just sort of giving that background there, just trying to explain that it's sort of not a quick fix. And these sort of reductions, sort of science-based reductions targets, which have been modelled on the actual science, so we know that, we have confidence in them, are sort of the best way to go, because there are so many issues associated with carbon offsetting, and that's sort of the reason why they're not accepted towards, your science-based targets.
That makes sense. And can you think of any examples of companies that have made progress in the decarbonising?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was sort of having a little browse on Science Based Targets Initiative the other day. They had a recent impact report out, and I was just sort of having a little look around. So there are currently around 72 companies in the fashion, footwear, and textiles industries who have set their near-term science-based targets, committing to limiting global warming by 1.5 degrees. And they include companies such as Adidas, Allbirds, Burberry, Levi's that I mentioned earlier as well. And out of those 72 companies, there are 23 who have also set or committed rather to a net zero target, but not set that target yet, as that sort of framework's relatively new. And as I just described, sort of setting your science-based targets is committing to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And it's a great sign that fashion brands are engaging. So Allbirds, for example, are looking really carefully at their materials and the recycled content of their packaging, some of their forefront carbon reduction strategy, whilst Levi's, on the other hand, are looking at sourcing renewable energy at all of their owned and operated sites, and also investing in their supply chain to drive decarbonisation sort of amongst their suppliers. So it's really interesting sort of seeing what different companies sort of identified as, sort of the main things that they want to prioritise at the moment.
And the companies that you work with, what sort of things are they doing?
Yeah, so there's all sorts going on. So renewable energy, sort of switching to renewable energy, similarly to Levi's at owned and operated sites, is a big one. It's a bit more of a challenge with supplier-owned sites, so sort of factories and things like that. But there is sort of there could be some influence over it, especially some of the bigger brands that we've worked for who do have that bit more influence purely for sort of volume of the garments that they're producing as well. And sort of some of our other companies like Finisterre sort of looking at the materials. They've got some really exciting new materials like their wetsuits that they sort of substituted out to have sort of a lower environmental impact. And also sort of we're seeing lots of companies launching refurbishment and repair services. Finisterre have their own sort of repairs workshop online. So yeah, all sorts of different things. In terms of packaging as well, we're seeing a reduction in the amount of packaging being used in general, which obviously has a knock-on effect for freighting as well. So the less weight we're sending, or less packaging we're sending, the lower the carbon emissions from freighting as well. So lots of exciting things.
And you conduct life cycle analysis on
Yeah.
clothing companies, don't you? So you look at,
Yeah.
Could you explain what a life cycle analysis is, please?
Yeah, sure. So a life cycle analysis looks at the environmental impact. I mean, for us specifically, the greenhouse gas emissions associated with every stage of a product's production. And so we tend to do cradle to grave life cycle analysis, which is basically looking at all of the inputs from the raw materials extraction, production and extraction, processing, manufacturing the product itself, whether it's a garment, whether it's something else, and then distributing, warehousing, all the transportation in between all those different legs, all the way through to the customer. And then if whatever the product is has sort of a use phase, or if it might require energy to use it, then that would be included as well, all the way through to the end of life. So the carbon emissions associated with whatever waste disposal method that product undergoes. So it's a really comprehensive and detailed look at every stage of a product's production.
So when you first started doing this, the life cycle analysis, was there anything that you saw in, the work that you were doing that you were kind of, oh wow, that jumped out at you and when I wasn't expecting that, or was it all I kind of was expecting most of this?
Yes and no. I would say the impact of the raw materials themselves often surprises me at how big a part of the product footprint they have. And that's just the raw materials themselves. And that sort of, you think about, all of the energy that goes into production and transporting products around sort of global networks. And you think that's going to be huge. And then you actually look at the results, and often it's actually the raw materials themselves which have the biggest impact. And I say that somewhat ironically, that tends to be where we tend to have the least detailed data, just because the way the world works, these big sort of global supply chains, and very far removed from sort of somebody actually growing the cotton in the ground. And sort of getting that sort of level of detail is so important, and something that I hope sort of the work that we do and other companies do will enable that sort of transparency all the way through the supply chain.
With regards to raw materials, I've had quite a few people on our podcast talking about natural products and then synthetic products. Does that make a difference on that life cycle? So I guess we could talk about wool, or basically plastic, isn't it? That's used instead of wool, polyester. Is there a difference?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's really complex, and there are sort of different schools of thoughts and sort of the natural versus synthetics textiles for clothing. So obviously polyester is made from fossil fuels, obviously a big negative, and it's a very energy intensive process. Recycled polyester is available, but there are again going to be greenhouse gas emissions associated with the recycling of that polyester. And because there are often plastics are produced sort of in products which have lots of different complex mixtures of different plastics, there are some challenges associated with the recycling of plastics and polyester, so that it can then be used in textiles and for garments. I suppose with wool, the farming practices, so the production of the sheep, have the biggest impact on sort of the life cycle of a woolen garment. That's mainly owing to the methane produced by the sheep as ruminant animals, as well as sort of lots of other inputs as well, in terms of the energy associated with farming, the land use, and the consequences on soil health and soil fertility, etc., etc. So there are sort of lots of environmental impacts associated with both. So it's kind of not as simple to say one's better than the other. I think it really has to be taken on a case-by-case basis and getting right down into the weeds of the data. So, literally going back to the farm level and saying what practices are used, what energy is used, how much is used, and assessing those impacts. Obviously, there are farming methods such as regenerative farming techniques, which are considered as much more environmentally friendly than conventional farming techniques. And similarly, sort of in that example of polyester as well, there are 100% recycled polyester can be used from 100% renewable energy, but then you've still got the microplastics and sort of toxins associated with polyester, whether it's recycled or not. So it's really not that simple.
And this is a rhetorical question. How do we disseminate that information, and how do we, educate consumers on this subject, really? And it's making it as simple as possible, because it's complicated from listening to you.
Yeah, it's really complicated.
Moving into, consumers, are people looking for sustainable or upcycled clothing?
Yes, absolutely. So a couple of weeks ago, I was actually at the launch party for a new company selling secondhand high street and designer clothes. And they're called The Circle. And there was such a buzz about the place. People seemed genuinely excited, to be looking at all these lovely secondhand pre-loved clothes, and also getting a bit of a bargain as well, which we mustn't forget, is obviously a benefit. And that's sort of just one example. There are lots of online retailers selling pre-loved secondhand clothing, shoes, and accessories that are all actually doing really well. And it's good to see it becoming more mainstream. Again, so that reuse of clothing. I'd say as well, we're also seeing lots of companies launching those sort of refurbishment and repair schemes on their website. So Finistère, as I mentioned before, who we've worked with, have launched a repairs workshop, and Patagonia sort of have a sort of long-standing worn wear hub as well, where you can sort of send in clothes that they'll refurbish and resell, or they sort of do repairs as well on sort of your clothing that you want back. So lots of exciting things going on. Another option is garment rentals as well. So there are some specialist companies doing just rentals, and even some sort of high street fashion retailers have trialled it. I think H&M trialled it maybe in the past few years, but hasn't quite become mainstream yet. But there's no reason why not. And I think it's that sort of, as I was talking about earlier, that societal mindset shift to make it sort of trendy and cool and normal.
And moving into Fashion Declares, it's London Fashion Week. You've been doing some work for Fashion Declares. Can you tell us a bit more about that organisation and what they do?
I worked with Fashion Declares and Sophia Minnie, who sort of one of the founders of that organisation, and she asked me to speak about decarbonising the supply chain and the fashion industry in a recent webinar, which was really good event and brought together some really interesting speakers from sort of various perspectives in the industry. So Fashion Declares, sort of as an organisation, is a sort of global movement of people within the fashion industry who all want to learn more, share best practices, and take effective action on climate, ecological and social problems. So sort of the concepts, they have 5 main goals. Fashion Declares have 5 main goals, which sort of range from social justice to decarbonisation and pushing for a sort of a regenerative fashion model. So sort of changing the fashion industry to act as a force for good and sort of promote responsible and sort of sustainable ways of working. And companies can commit to those goals by signing an open letter on their website. So it's sort of, bringing companies in the fashion industry together as a collective force for all of the good things that we've been talking about today.
Brilliant. I mean, that sounds really positive.
Yeah.
Are you optimistic about the industry, and is it moving in the right direction?
So again, I suppose yes and no. I think the tools are there. And companies and the public are starting to sort of sit up and listen. There's, even sort of things on Instagram, you're starting to get more and more bloggers, fashion bloggers, things like that, and Instagram stars starting to talk about, the sustainability of fashion. Lots of brands are jumping on board. I think that awareness in the public is really starting to gain a bit of traction. It made me really, really excited to go to the Circle launch party the other week and see people so engaged with secondhand clothing. I think that's so important, that this reused, recycled, repaired clothing becomes really normalised in society and even sort of desirable. And I think sort of at the company level, there are some really forward-thinking companies, especially those we've worked with, like Finisterre, who are making some serious commitments to reducing their environmental impact. But on the flip side of that, there are also still a lot of sort of the bigger players who are sort of still paying lip service to sustainability. And it would be really good to see them all signed up to science-based targets, all setting their net zero targets, and even perhaps being held accountable to some of those targets at some point.
On the questions that we ask anyone that wants to come and work at Green Element, it's what's one of the campaigns you're most unimpressed with. It always surprises me how many people talk about the H&M campaigns, and it really does say such a big story, because generally I would say that most people who want to come and work for us in most of the roles are younger, between 20 and 35. And I would imagine that H&M's target market is between 20 and 35. So their target market are switching off. Their target market are going, you're greenwashing. And that's got to say something to them. I did think about anonymizing all the data and then sending them all the answers and going, look, your target market think it's rubbish. Do something about it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. The traction is growing. There's so much more awareness, as you say, especially in that sort of age group, which is great. And I think, we need people to sort of start demanding that change, which I think they are. Actually, I think they are.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, thank you, Alicia, for joining us on this podcast today.
Thanks for having me.
And if you'd like to learn more about decarbonising the fashion industry, you can find a link to the Fashion Declares website in the show notes. There's a link to our website there as well. And if you want to feedback, or if you have any questions, feel free to DM us at Green Element through LinkedIn, Twitter or Facebook. Thanks for listening. I'm Will Richardson from Green Element. Don't forget to rate and subscribe the podcast so you don't miss an episode. And we'll be back next month. Until then, take care. So you really enjoy sustainability and want to be a part of the solution? Come and join our vibrant community now. Book a call and we can talk more.